Good afternoon. I am Sang Kwan, a member of the faculty at the University of Tokyo and also at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. It is a privilege for me to help inaugurate a new lecture series based online with guests from A+U's featured issues. While COVID-19 has restricted our ability to travel, it has also allowed new virtual venues to flourish and created new possibilities of online encounters. It seems so appropriate that we should launch these online lectures here to complement the print magazines where our collaborators can share with us what they're now thinking through a platform that is more timely and accessible than ever before. In fact, this time slot at 3 p.m. in Tokyo was specifically selected to encompass as broad a spectrum of time zones as possible, allowing everyone from the West Coast of North America to Western Europe to join at a reasonable hour. Before I introduce the speakers, let me just briefly do a rundown of our event this afternoon. The lecture itself should be about 35 to 40 minutes. This will be followed by a Q&A session. I have a couple of questions prepared beforehand to get things started, but all of you in the audience are more than welcome to send us your questions. There should be a link on the YouTube page to the Slido app where you will be able to send us your questions, and we'll keep track of them once we are in the Q&A session of this afternoon's program. A+U's February issue features the work of Zurich-based firm E2A, founded in 1997 by Pete Eckert, our speaker today, together with his younger brother, Wim. Pete is also a full professor at the Technical University of Dortmund in Germany, having previously taught at Mendrisio amongst other leading schools of Europe. Both he and his brother worked at OMA in Rotterdam and received their architectural training at the Federal Institute of Technology at the ETH in Zurich before launching their own office. As you can see from this wonderful monograph, their practice has truly prospered with a series of wonderful projects that exude a sense of discipline on the one hand and tremendous imagination on the other. Without further ado, I turn the podium over to Pete.
Thank you, Sang Kwan, for this kind introduction. I'm going to share my screen with trying to set this up here. Do you see my screen?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, so it's a pleasure for me, and good morning from Switzerland. As Sang Kwan said, this is a particular time here to really reach so many people also across the globe. It's 7 o'clock in the morning here. I'm trying to give you an insight about the way my brother and me work on our project. We call this issue, but also our work, in a frame of strategic methodologies. We are very interested in methodologies in the sense of how do we get today really to an architectural result, and what really influences us effectively by doing so. I start this short lecture with a small statement. And it says, a strategic architecture mixes elements, value systems, and action logics. It opens up a combination of essential priorities. The target of strategic architecture is to manage the coexistence of conflicting values. This is very important for us. We kind of analyzing really a lot in the office in order to learn from paradoxes or from discrepancies, so to speak, how to deal with things that seemingly is not fitting together. The combination of multiple architectural conditions within a single system inherently challenges the conventional view of a building identity and our notion and understanding of autonomous types. It could be seen as a tool to elaborate a specific combination of program, structure, or typologies in order to deal and to systemize discrepancies. So, though we find a lot of discrepancies, we are interested how to order them, how to make them to live with. Mixing, assembling, arranging, and composing diverse identities in order to obtain a new singularity in which parts are recognizable but no longer restorable. Yeah? So this is a kind of an interest that you might also link to the aspect of hybridity, how things come together, and due to the fact that we fuse them, in fact, they become something else. Yeah, I think is one of my favorite artists, Jusovic, a Croatian architect and also artist, creating this work pipe in the form of a shoe, and it kind of course, enlightens this idea that I'm trying to make up here. Within the realm of art, finding a specific cross-section that really connects to some extent nothing, that has nothing together between the pipe and a shoe, but by the fact it fuses its condition. And by that, of course, art doesn't have to create or find a new functionality. That's the force of art. But at the other hand, you see in a very obvious and evident way, the way that a new object arises, and a new object that can be read in many different metaphorical ways, between the male and the female, between the patternette and the elegance, etc., etc. You know, so this is an interest that has followed us from the very early beginning on. My brother and me, we started basically our work by using the work of Mies and speculating, so to speak, on issues, how, for example, you could step up scales, or how you can find configurations that would lead to new either programmatical, performative, or configurative constellations. And we used the architecture of Mies at the time to liberate ourselves really specifically from the aspect of architecture, because the architecture of Mies was so sublime that it could give us a kind of a moment of freedom, not to have the obligations to think about architecture by always imposing what the architecture must or should be. I think that kind of enlightens a similar process. In 2006, we won a competition in Berlin, which was the competition for the Heinrich Böll Foundation, and we used still this technique to combine typological mergers, and we made this montage, which is the Farnsworth House embedded in the Seagram building, and this confrontation, so to speak, of two fundamental different typologies and fundamental different architectures in one architecture together, this fusion, so to speak, was our access into solving a whole number of problematic issues on site. So we used the Seagram building to kind of enlighten the high repetition, so to speak, of an office building, and the Farnsworth House as a unique gesture of a great political conference center in the middle of Berlin. And we transferred, so to speak, this strategic image into a model, we call them white model, which basically give the strategy, so to speak, a formal expression, and you see well this kind of empty level and the kind of close levels of offices that sort of transcends this relationship. And at the time we were exposed by an extreme budget shortage, and we had to build 7,500 square meters for 10 million euros coming from Switzerland. We thought there were 2/3 of the budget missing. So, but we succeeded. And what is interesting about this strategy, and I'm referring to this very early project because it is the same model as you see now, you know. So what you see here is the line that sort of most architects fear, which is the red line, the horizontal line, the cost horizon which your client gives you, in which you have to operate an architectural solution. We kind of made a provocation to this line and said we were interested to completely polarize this condition. So the red dots which you see are extremely expensive elements that we used in this building, which occur exactly once. And we calculated this by a frequency of green dots, so very cheap elements that had a very high frequency. So what we did is, instead of running a flat line, we tried to open sort of the spline, if you could say. And what you see is that it's the same model, and this is for us is very exciting or very interesting. This is the architectural formal expression of that. This is where you save money, and this is where you spend it. Yeah. So that there is a kind of almost a deal in your own architecture with what kind of intensity, what kind of prioritization, what kind of let's say attention almost you work on the project. And it's not a project that is not detailed focused, but it's an architecture that relates to exactly this strategic axis. Of course, it got built and is running successfully. So over the years, we collected this catalog, and we were getting more and more aware that this aspect of methodology we were really interested in can be juxtaposed, can be compared, can be related to each other. And this is actually what is our sense of the body of our work, because we operate basically exactly in a way that we trying to find a answer to an analyzed brief that discovers things that might be risky or incoherent, so to speak, and then we're trying to impose this as a strategic form. I'm showing a few projects because I'm aware about the shortage of the time, but we look at a western part in Zurich, which used to be a back office area, warehouse area, with lots of different types of buildings, a relatively robust quarter, so to speak, because an impression of the nearby context. So a kind of a mixed area between workshops, so to speak, and large back office of international banks. And this is the context where we have been asked by our client to design a new high-rise building in Swiss terms, so 40 meters. And we received basically this program. And the program was, we had to sort it out, we had to organize the program, and it was a business hotel, it was a palliative care, healthcare concept, it was a client that is a diaconry, so they were based basically in the health business. So it was an office building that, an office program that had to go along, extra medical care practices as well, administration, a daycare, collaborator, restaurant, a public restaurant, a conference center. What else was the question? So the problem is the moment you kind of exceed a number of frequencies of program, you lose the program. So if the moment enters where you can see this is a kind of a mixed mixed use building, you immediately or are exposed to the condition where you realize that you lose the relevance of program. And the question that arises is, how do you make an architecture that really works independently of program and activity in your project? So the first part of our commission was basically to encounter exactly this condition, and we came up with a kind of a very resilient idea to develop a load-bearing concept with a gridded facade and an eccentric core, which you see from the other side, so a slightly shifted core in that system to allow different spans in the building. And basically an architecture that deals with exactly these two components, core and load-bearing facades. There's not a singular column in this building, and the urban scheme was a kind of creating or allowing a slab building 40 meters high, 15 wide, 85 meters long. And this was the project. The first phase of our contractual delivery, so to speak, was to kind of an accentuation of a load-bearing facade and an eccentric array of cores that could deliver and perform on a simultaneous base different programs, such as a palliative care next to a business hotel. And this was the expression of space. So it was a concrete shell, so to speak, with a concrete core in situ, and with load-bearing facades that were designed by precast elements. You see how this small high-rise, this slender slab building sits in a kind of courtyard condition. And these were the elements that we have designed. These were the precast elements that became the load-bearing elements on the inside. And we could basically build the building like a Lego building. So with a very high speed, the building got assembled on site. And you see the progression here, the assembly. And what we had in mind is to kind of intensify exactly these two elements. So the precast elements of concrete were done in a perfection that there was absolutely no necessity nor a financial possibility to really cover them. So what the idea was that there is a kind of a primary expression of architecture that really resembles the core and the load-bearing facades and leaves the space, the span in between, basically as a filling, as a complementary architectural agenda. We accounted this project with a window, which is a slider, which is in Switzerland very difficult to do because sliding normally had brushes, and sliders are not really tight windows. So you lose a lot of energy, and we designed this building as an electric slider that was combined with air pressure, which you know from any bus in Tokyo or in Zurich, where every time that the door is closing, they put pressure in the lips, and therefore you get a tightening condition of your window. And so we managed to organize a window that could be opened through the release of air pressure and closed. And it was a kind of automotive, so to speak, an automotive project that got assembled on site. So the project that sort of had a very resilient, robust expression of architecture had this slider that to some extent could always react to any activity or simultaneity in the project. So although the project is very rigorous in the sense of order, it is very playful in its consequences. You see how the building sits very calmly, almost stoically, in a kind of very heterogeneous site with all kinds of different types of buildings and makings and ambitions. And you see slight irritations from a sense of order that sort of expresses individual activities of individual programs that we, in a way, cannot steer anymore, and are looking into a system where we create this rigorosity in order to allow a kind of a very relaxed way of in a very tolerant way, so to speak, of what happens else, in the sense. Originally, we thought that this building would be built, or the fit outs inside, with all kinds of interior architects. This was the normal plan, you know, that but we could build a very good relation to our clients, and then they started to commission us for the hotel, for the palliative. So in a way, it was a very defensive strategy, but luckily we could in the end design the entire building as if we could test our own strategy. You see these shifts and so on. And this was basically the approval, or the system. We had an office layer, and you see now how the same building supports a fundamental different program, such as a healthcare clinic, which is here, such as a business hotel, which is here. So it is a kind of a very interesting way to sort of sustain these approaches of interior exploitation of the building. And I give you just a few images, and you see that this concrete shell, so to speak, that the load-bearing wall has always been the same, but it's never the same. And this is exactly what we were aiming for. So this is a very a primal expression of architecture that's getting countered by different tones, different materials, different lyrics, so to speak. This was the business hotel. So you see how a wood fit out encounters our concrete shell. So this was part of the hotel. This was part of the suites on the top level. You see always the same elements, always the concrete elements that are, through different kind of uses, are just changing sort of context. But it kind of shows how this resilience of architecture can really be performative. And every time it creates a different setting, every time it creates a different atmosphere. Later, we built our own office in it. It's a very simple concept. It's an aisle of 85 meters. So we run the whole length of the building, and which works with the same concept again. So really using this expression of concrete to encounter the palliative healthcare, which has which is a delicate program, because people are being served and cared for in their last moment of lives. You see this also here, the architecture can really anticipate to requests of a fundamental different activity in the program, or the daycare with 85 kids, which runs on a daily basis in the building, uses the niches fundamentally different, ground level related conference center, the public restaurant. So I could go on with this basically, but it is kind of an interesting discovery in your own architecture that by doing something very resilient, you free yourself for many possibilities. So it is a proactive strategy to make things possible, rather than to be on a controlling mode, in the sense of that only what someone, or only what you like might access it into the building. The result, and this is why I like this image, which is a kind of a far zoom, is a kind of almost a Robert Altman shortcut moment of life, of complete similarity and complete simultaneity, while people dying are people in their diapers, or while people are working in their business hotel, other architects work in the office. So it is a moment, a sort of a still of a Altman-esque simultaneity of life, which makes our urban context, I think, in an enriching way. So I'm shifting to a different program, educational program. Public building is a big issue for us. We think that we should try all our architects colleagues as well to strengthen the architectural discipline all along public buildings, because it's so important, the expression of the public institutional architecture. Now, this is a very prestige site. It's an old school campus with an early Swiss modernist architecture school on the one side, from the former city architect Hermann Herter in Zurich, and on the other hand, there's an old national style school building from the 19th century. And our extension sits in a very low habit and tries to accomplish and extend this site. The program was a very challenging one. It was a triple sporting hall and a secondary school with classrooms, libraries, school kitchen, and the possibility also to facilitate the midday lunch area. So you see the silhouettes of the building. We're trying to really not interfere into the two listed buildings that are organizing this perpendicular space frame. And what we have done, and it enlightens maybe this interest in this strategic methodology, is we very quickly realized that we were interested in actually merging the architecture of the hall with the architecture of the school. Normally in a campus, of course, you would do it apart. But the one is creating an obligation, so to speak, to the other, you know, and by doing that, it creates the question, how are you imposing one obligation to the other, and what can you discover from that? So the image you see is a triple sport hall that got structured and spanned by a space frame, and on the top level there's a school sitting on top of this hall. The sport hall is sunken into the ground, and this created this structural model where you see this is basically the space frame bridging the deep in the underground lying sport hall, and this creates a different proportion, this creates a different dimension for the school that arises on top. This was the triple sport hall, the plan on the underground. You see 1, 2, 3 halls, you see the guardrobes, and here you see we are almost finishing the building by end of March. We are happy to give it over to the city. So you see the space frames that go across, that basically sit in the ground level and create the daylight access into it, and then deeply in it we organize this hall. And then this is the ground level, which with the foot, the entry, the core system, the library area, and the teacher center. And then you go basically one flight up, and then you reach the classroom level, and you see here the insight into the hall, and you see the space frame going across, which creates this logic of ruled and standard sporting halls, so to speak. And it creates a dimension for the school which is very bizarre, because let's say if you build classrooms independently from a gym room, you would make a different layout, which is clear, you know. And what we did to really exploit the extra depth of the space is we turned the classroom perpendicularly 90 degrees and used the short side and introduced the second facade, so to speak. So they lit from two sides, and that creates a kind of an expression of roof that you see here, which is basically a combination between a pitch and a shed. Yeah. So what we create is there's a lighting system for the aisle, and in the next bay there is a lighting system for the classroom. So and this creates this roof system that is basically the architectural answer to the brief to create a school with an extra depth of space. You see this quite well in the drawings. This is the pitch condition of the classrooms, and you see now how the pitch opens in a shed way, skylighting basically the central aisle, which is a didactic free zone which you can play in groups, and then again in the next bay how the light is being introduced on two sides, from the outside and from the skylight side. You see the space frames that sort of go across, that sits on the sporting hall, and therefore creates a very intense package. You could say an alter ego or an obligation of a new body that sort of need both elements to be kind of architecturally to be exploited. You see the long section, you see the same system. And this roof, of course, was linking also to the neighborhood, to the pitch roofs of the neighborhood. So from that, we could link back into a kind of a contextual behavior. And you see these are the shots, not yet fully finished, but you see quite well this pavilion-like roof, lightening basically these two conditions, the aisle and the classroom. Another view to that, the classrooms at the corner. The affinity to the ongoing process of refurbishment, the architecture of the existing school. Schools are important because they, in a way, allow us to think in a very prototypical way about the role of architecture, the role, how you anticipate to program. This is a school in a very prestigious outskirt in Zurich. You see the lake in the far background, and it's a school that has been designed in the 60s, and we were asked to extend this school and on a beautiful site. And what we did, of course, just from the point of view, we're just creating a very dense, squarish building to kind of maintain as much as possible this beautiful landscape. And it's a kind of a stacking idea. So, but the story was much more complex, and it also gives you an insight how you could strategically react to this. The school is so wealthy that these wealthy people send their kids nowadays in private schools. We all, my generation, are people that went to public school because Switzerland was investing a lot into the public education. So this was a project to really reactivate the public school, to really encounter the condition that school is also a social melting pot, and it should really also deliver the possibilities for all to access to education. So the program that we were used to have in Switzerland to deal with schools were fundamentally different, and it was very provocative in that sense. You see the model. So we came up with this concept, which is basically a school which you see with the corridors. These are only representing the formal configuration of the corridors. And we used the corridors as a structural system because the program for the first time asked really for a completely flexible classroom. We never experienced this so far in Switzerland, because normally the classrooms are like fixed modules of 80 square meters, and then let's say the corridors are the flex zone or the niche areas. Here, they actually really had a claim to say we need classrooms that start at 18 square meters and maybe we end up with 240 square meters. So we encountered basically the first time a complete solution of classrooms, and we designed basically a structure that had a stable, a very, again, a resilient structural aspect of the corridors. You see the corridor expression here, and then on every level we rotated this on 90 degrees. So this was a corridor, this was a big span of classroom, this was a corridor, a big span of classroom. So there is a kind of an interplay of what you do with corridors and with the liberty that you gain from it. Then the superimposition of the model basically shows this. It's a very simple action in itself to simply rotate every level of 90 degrees in order that the corridors prevent the span or prevent the sagging from the large spans, you know. So the corridor would attack here, and then you pick up, so to speak. It's working like a pickup beam, and therefore there is an intense relationship between what's supposed to be stable and what's supposed to be on a permanent change. And you will discover again the strategy that, as in a previous project, where you see that our interest is in exactly these points. So I worked very intensively with the structural engineer. You see these flexibilities, the section with the staircases, with the spiral staircases in the center. See this? Now this is ground level. Now you see the plan of the regular level of the school, the rotation of 90 degrees. And the result are open classrooms which have all kinds of different divisions where you can subdivide classrooms. You see almost an industrial expression of it, where you see these are the devices where you can cut down classrooms in an hour or something, or in a half an hour, just by paneling, by allowing basically a 23-meter span to be subdivided in their structural rhythms. It's the main staircase and expression. So you can have half open conditions, or atelier teachings, or small group teaching. And the consequences is it delivers the architectural expression by that means. You know, it's like it's no longer a question whether it's a style or not. It's just simply sort of reflects this programmatic issue about flexibility and definition, or stability and change. In a very similar way, we won this project of the Taz, which is the leftish newspaper center in Berlin. It's important for us that this was a site that was linked to the early 80s of the IBA. You see John Haydock, you see these kind of discoveries at the 80s, where the work in Berlin was not driven by completion of blocks, so to speak, but by working with fragments. So a total different premise at the time, with a absolutely beautiful project by John Haydock, small tower, small attention. So it was just opposite side of our site at Friedrichstraße. If you know Berlin, if you work on Friedrichstraße, it's one of the most, let's say, historically driven, dominated streets of Berlin. It has been destroyed through the World War. It has been subdivided, Checkpoint Charlie. So it is a kind of a concept where let's say the faith of Berlin is being written in, and at the south end, which was always disconnected through the history of Berlin, we designed basically for this client a new headquarter. The client is basically a media agency, but it's a leftish union, so it's not a corporate, it's a union for this newspaper. And it's to some extent extremely chaotic. This was our site visit in their old office. I never could imagine that you could pile so much paper, but it was super chaotic in a way. And what we came up is with a concept that sort of were two: a performative idea of a net going around the building, but also a metaphor in that sense, to say every member of the net is part of this union idea, because you cannot have a hierarchy, you cannot simply take a member off. So we created basically an architecture that dealt with 150 or 1.50 meters, and creating a structure that stiffed out the building through its diaphragma of structures. So we had no cores. So the building is coreless, and therefore creating a huge depth to be exploited by the company itself. And I never really met such an honest client, because they said, like, we need to come together on one point, but we have absolutely no idea what the future brings, you know. So in the media business, it's very important that the media business has the ability also spatially to reinvent itself, to say, how are we going to work? And this was our model, sort of to give them a very precise architectural edge, leaving a lot of flexibility in the inside, producing this liberty to mess around, so to speak, or to kind of keep going with the mess, etc. So we gave them something which is almost something as an occupancy strategy for them, for their own agency, so as if they squat their own new headquarters. This was a kind of relation that we started to deal with. The construction, it is an interesting example that engineering, structural, civil engineering work and architectural work comes together at one point, is the same. The expression of the detail and the expression and the making of it is the architecture. So it's a very simple plan with a central core, no core in itself, leaving this depth in it, these large depths in the space. And this is how they squatted the building. And you might be irritated, but they have dogs there, and they work with plants and all kinds of things. But the longer I really visit them, the more I really like it. And it exactly gives you this relationship between how architecture can really dominate, be really resilient and picky, so to speak, about the expression of the way you want to really express, and how much liberty you can give back in a very relaxed way, you know. And I found this very interesting. A few other expressions. This is the main meeting room where they have their redaction meetings. The ground level, this is how we gave them the building. So it's a very almost infrastructural expression where the occupancy comes through usage. And you will see this expression is used. I mean, it's not that the opportunity passed by, but this is the current restaurant. They put the restaurant in the ground level. So there's a lot of simultaneous occupancy in the building. The facade basically got mirrored to the outside with a very fine net of galvanized steel, which has this kind of very thin layer of metal that reflects the color of Berlin and therefore integrates it back into the system. I'm coming to the last project. As a master plan, Zurich outskirts, a city that has massive growth over the last 15 years. A typical agglomeration project. This is our project here on a site where you normally would not make any housing project, but since everyone needs housing and housing shortage is so dramatic, you as architects have to impose this and have to think how you can things make possible so that there's still a healthy condition of housing. It is linked to the track field, to a highway access, so on. So we have almost a triple-sided exposure to noise with 85 dB, so really high exposures. And what we did is we introduced the core and we started to kind of organize a ondulation that produces through this geometric intervention 150% of the original length. So we make out of a constraint a strategy that gives us a possibility that normally no one would grant you to do to increase the surface of your architecture. And by doing this, we can expose, we can link, so to speak, the architecture and the apartments to a very calm, secure core. And this is the strategic model again, the structural model. Creating this kind of own imposed courtyard. You see the building from the outside, a similar expression, primarily the structure, which you see the filling and metal panels, the opening of the court that sort of filters now all the apartments to the adjacent upcoming park. You see how we open up this system. It's a skeleton structure that sort of extends into the balconies, the ground level with social activities, main entry, kindergarten, shops. This is the courtyard, which runs along a kind of an arcade, becomes the meeting point, so to speak, of the inhabitants, and has this kind of capacity to create almost a micro-urban condition where let's say it creates its own sense of neighborhood with its own intensity, exposure. You see the plan that sort of operate to negotiate between the orthogonal condition of the perimeter and the 45 degrees angle to really view all into this upcoming public park, which you should see. You see these structural expressions. This is the park, this is the view. So everyone basically filters and see through this concept of opening up and securing a calm side for apartments. It's the inside of the apartments, the cores. And what it is interesting is like this negotiation of perpendicular condition and 45 degrees produces their own causal relation, their own complexity, so to speak, in the architecture of the apartments. It's not style, it's performance. And this is what is more interesting for us to really work exactly in this framing of these two constellations. And you see how complex the apartments rise from a simple outer condition to an and then this shows the way that the skeleton and the space is being organized, and it produces diagonal complex apartment as a consequence of space. This is my last slide. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Piet, for this fantastic presentation. We have a large number of questions, so I'm very, very eager to get to them. So I will put one of my questions out there first, and then we can get to the questions from the audience. And I think my question has to do with this idea of global and local that is expressed, I think, in quite a few of the projects, and also your conversation with Mark Lee that is part of this A+U feature issue. There's this line that a passage that makes reference to the time you spent at OMA in Rotterdam in the mid-1990s, and you described what you saw there was the sense that architecture that is something that could be embedded in a larger overall context. And I'm saying this perhaps in juxtaposition to, I think I would not be wrong to say that there is a strong sense of Swissness in your architecture. Maybe this idea of atmosphere that was put forth by SIK at the ETH in the 1980s and onward, where of course you and your contemporaries were, it became very, very influential. So there, and this dualism between, let's say, metropolitanism on the one hand, and the local, the atmospheric, this particular sensibility and the building culture of Switzerland, and how do you reconcile between maybe these two poles of tension in your architecture?
I think the metropolitan aspect of it is a mental focus, you know, and the Swissness sort of is an opportunity. Yeah, so you cannot, but the one is, I think, our ambition, and the other is an opportunity that we are able to base an expression of architecture in Switzerland. I would say the metropolitan is more important because it is linked to the analysis of briefings, the analysis of, or that leads to our strategic access to architecture, and it makes us also capable of building abroad. Which, in a way, the aspect of the way you refer to chic. That obliges sort of the perfectionism of creating an atmosphere becomes very vulnerable the moment you can no longer rely on Swissness. Yeah, it's you know what I mean. Yeah? So that's why you take both opportunities if you can. Mm-hmm. Because to some extent, architecture remains an opportunistic profession. So if you can link to a building technology that excels perfection, there's not really a reason to pass by, you know. So but if you enlarge your circle of interventions, or if you start work in Berlin where they hardly know how to organize a homework, then you no longer can create a base on such an atmospheric approach. Yeah. So in other words, the strategy must anticipate so strongly that the result is more a kind of a process rather than an image. Yeah. And this is what I try to show, because one of the early projects in Berlin was an eye-opener for us that we could bring back. So the diaconary project, in a sense, makes a perfection in terms of materials, but it could have survived, so to speak, also with a much less ambitious architecture of the interior. So it is not on the same point, not on the same importance, I think, of our considerations.
Let me just add, put a follow-up comment to that, maybe not necessarily a question. I'm also reminded of this essay that Christian Sumi contributed to the issue, where he made the reference of your architecture. This is also a term that you use, of your architecture being an infrastructural approach. And Sumi's essay in describing your architecture contextualizes this infrastructural approach in, again, this Swiss tradition of the bridges and roads through the mountains. But it seems to me that, in fact, this infrastructural approach has a tremendously powerful metropolitan potential, allows you to overcome the limitations of the specific national context of Switzerland.
Yeah, that's sharply analyzed. Yes, I fully agree. The aspect of or the way that Christian Sumi has analyzed this is for us quite an enriching perspective, because it is true that the infrastructural idea is an architecture that cannot be reduced anymore. It is creating the absolute base condition of making things possible or connecting, and both traditionally, culturally, but also conceptually, it is superimposed, so to speak. And for us, this gets quite close to what we look. I mean, there he had a very nice juxtaposition between the long section of the diachronary building and the Brazilian megastructure, which his students analyzed in Mendrisio. So these two had this kind of surprising similarities.
Yeah,
but also at different scales, I have to say, different scales.
I was really delighted to see that to that reference to the Brazilian superstructure. I've always found it fascinating. I'm glad somebody is talking about it. But let's get to the questions from the audience. I'm going to group some of the questions together. There's a cluster of questions that talk about the model. And so your white models. The question is, at what point during the development of a project you reference back to the white models? At what stage in the design process, do the white models actually represent? And the kind of parallel to that is the question between how you treat physical models versus render models. And I guess another third question having to do with this issue of representation in the creative process is the collages. Could you tell us a little bit about the role of collages in your design process? I'll just add, for those of you who may not have seen this issue yet, there's a wonderful little vignette essay by the two of them, called Plan, Image, and Model, which goes into this issue in quite detail. But maybe we can also ask Pete to speak a little bit on this issue of models and representations.
We work basically, well, the questions, to summarize, in a way, is a question on processing and, again, methodology. How to design your design process, so to speak. And what we do is we always work with plan, image, and model at the same time. So for us, this is an absolute necessity to work on simultaneous basis. So we are not designing a plan, then making an image, and then building a model, but we actually do this really on a simultaneous basis. Sometimes we do a plan to do a model rather than a plan as an architectural expression. Why do we do this? Because we don't trust. Yeah, we're kind of paranoid about to believe that the plan would deliver the architecture, or that only the image can deliver, let's say, the consequences of structural obligations of an architecture. And therefore, we try to impose in our office a simultaneity of plan, image, and model. Now, the white model, so to speak, is a stripped model. Yeah. It's not it's not basically simulating reality, so to speak, or creating a kind of stage set in order to create an impression how the building would be in the end. It is a stripped model that sort of gives us the view on what is relevant for us, you know, or where the architectural driver is being based in the project. So if we get rid of floors, so to speak, to see the interplay between columns and beams, then the expression of columns and beams will become the architectural driver of the project. So it is a kind of selective filter to represent the architectural, spatial ambitions, and creating at the same time a possibility to say or to express a priority, so to speak, of importances and of elements that would be less of an importance, you know. And this is very important if you talk about the strategic axis of architecture, because you need to know where you are really want to express a resilient condition, where everything you do is willful and absolutely never accidental, and where you allow this aspect of tolerance where even third parties could operate in your own building. Yeah. So this is the role of white models. Now the image is much more delicate, because we are currently flooded by images, every one of us, you know. It's like you see thousands of images per day, and we try to impose also here in the same way a kind of a method to create an image. And what we do is we use the collage, because we trying to link the experience we hope that our architecture is transcending into a kind of historic development. So we search for our own experiences, for our education, for our memory, so to speak. Did architectural history and did the photography of architectural history cope with such a situation or with such a condition in previous projects? So this is why Mark asked us very, very intensely about it, because when we organized this competition for the Europa Allee in Switzerland, you have to say the European then was a rise of scale. You know, they today you would politically not say this anymore, but this is another question. But it was named like this because they wanted to be part of that scale. You know, so how do you render an image that sort of transcends the rise of scale of a city? Yeah. And we found this very interesting to combine this early Smithson's project from the Economist, which is an iconic moment. You know, it's not crowded. it's actually almost a moment of solitude, you know, where you see the passenger, so to speak, from the backside in a rainy London day with reflections on the floor. But it was so imminently urban, so imminently associated to a large city. We used the scene and embedded it into our own architecture. And this montage, or this collage to bring things together, was a very interesting topic for us, because it enables the image to create integration, while the white model is not an integration, not a contextual, but it's more a strategic instrument to express your own architecture. I hope this gives you an insight.
That's a very helpful way of juxtaposing them. Thank you. I'll ask a question, and this is from the audience, but also very close to my heart, and talking about the role of structural design in your design process. There are obviously these very smart, very sophisticated solutions that are so clearly embedded in the overall design strategy. And Switzerland and Japan, of course, are two countries where the collaboration between structural design on the one hand and architectural design on the other hand are extremely interlinked and collaborate at a very thorough and fundamental level. So could you talk a little bit about how you engage with your structural engineers? How do they participate in the design process?
Mm-hmm. We consider our structural engineers as alter egos. Yeah. We need them from the beginning, and we need them till the end. Yeah. And I think, and I hope that they think the same way, but I'm almost convinced. I hope that that my presentation enlightened this, that the work, the common work, so to speak, produces architecture. So structural engineer is not a discipline, it's not a service to us, and architecture is not independent to it. And therefore, it's a collaborative base from the beginning to come to a point where the structural expression becomes an important issue about the architecture. It's part of the architectural result, so to speak. So this makes the collaboration indispensable from the beginning. And this is also the way we're trying to convince other economies where we work, like in Germany, for example. They have absolutely no awareness about that, you know, so they think like an architect is drawing up a drawing, and then and this is the idea, and then they tender it out, and the cheapest will calculate it, you know. But they don't realize that the intelligence saves more money than the cheapest can ever save. You know what I mean? So it is a process where we also have an intense discussion with our dear colleagues. How we can sometimes survive these tender procedures because the specificity, the obligations, and the interplay between structure and architecture needs to be so intense that they have such an advance in the tender procedure that they get along with us to realize the projects. It's a very accurate question. We have this right now at the moment, where we have been commissioned now in Germany, in Bremen, for a very large auditorium building. It's a high-rise building, 60 meters high. And
it's in the journal, but it was not part of your lecture this afternoon. But
yes, I very hope that, and you see that the structure is very, very intensely collaborated, and I am very much hope that our dear colleagues from Schnetzer Puskas will make the tender, because we plan to do a common building.
Yeah.
So it is a very important question, and we have to be very careful that we realize how market economy works today, and we have to organize a process of work where the process is also influencing the conditions of the market economy, so that this intelligence remains in the project.
Yeah. Thank you. It's 4 after 4, let me, and I should say P has very generously agreed to just staying on for a few more minutes. I'm trying to squeeze in one more question from the audience, but maybe tweaked a little bit based on our conversation so far. And the question has to do with your references, your sources of references, whether they're historical, ideological, formal, etc. References that are maybe somewhere in your subconscious. This is, of course, something that's the conversation that you had with Mark Lee. This is something that you went into in quite some detail. But let me maybe make a side comment to that to make it more specific. The idea of Rossi, of course, and also the tendenza, the Italian movement from the 1970s was brought up. And I'm thinking of these amazing photographs of the white models, particularly of the auditorium in Bremen you're talking about. It's this one here. I have it pulled up, this one here. And this really reminded me, in fact, of watercolor. So Donald Judd in the late 70s and early 80s, when he had started MAFA in Texas, he was working with his partner at the time, somebody called Loretta Vinciarelli, who was part of the Tendenza movement in the 1970s. And she started, she passed away a few years ago, but for many, many years, she created these incredible watercolors with an atmosphere, with this kind of blurred bokeh type of representation that really reminded me, well, these photographs of your white models reminded me of her work. Can you speak a little bit maybe to these references, to the question of historical references and the issue of memory, perhaps, that came through in this conversation with Mark, referencing Rossi, Kohoff, and the Tendenza?
I think this discussion was driven by how, let's say, these references influences us in our own curriculum, because we were exposed to it. We were taught by Flora Rüscher at the ETH in the ground years, in the base studies, and it was a kind of a very fundamental education and awareness of how to deal with architecture, and also regarding, to some extent, how modesty and sensuality can be perceived at the same time. So for me, this was a very important moment to realize this is what you learn from your teacher, is remaining in your awareness. I totally believe in this. So I think she was very important for us. And then Hans Kohlhoff, and I mean, we are not the generation of exposed with Aldo Rossi, but there was this meta context of Aldo Rossi at the school, because he was earlier. But with Kohlhoff, it was very interesting, because Kohlhoff introduced a kind of a very urban awareness at the city, at the ETH in our education, that was importantly linked to the idea of rising scale.
Yeah.
How to rise scale is a very, very relevant question. Yeah. You cannot make a beautiful little house and then make on the methodology way. You cannot do the same 10 times bigger, you know. So you have to change your process, you know. And he introduced this to our educational path, and that was before, let's say, his personal reference became so linked, let's say, to the traditional expression of architecture. So we had this moment where he was more considered to be the wild new rather than the traditional. Yeah. So this was important because it was we learned how that architecture delivers and performs in a city, and what it had to do. So for me, this was there were two milestones, so to speak. So we talk about the reference now in the sense of influences of our curriculum, not necessarily of visual references to our work. But I think the previous is much more important than the latter. You mentioned the photographies of our white models. I think this has to be mentioned. We working with a photographer, John Neyman, an American native photographer that follows us more than 20 years now. Is a good personal friend of mine, and he adds a lot to the perception. So you have to imagine we think and build our models, and he sees them. Yeah. So it's a very important collaboration in the sense that because he transcends something which then through the photography creates another reference. It makes it sometimes important whether it is like this or like this, but you build it like this, but he sees it like that. And this is an impact, it's a collaboration, and it shows again that that what you do is being accomplished by many others also in this process, and therefore I really want to acknowledge him on that basis. I think he's one of the really rare masters of photography to create with to work with our models. So I love his work. But I discover my own work through his work, and this is an interrelation in the process. So that in a way, strangely, we also learned at OMA to rely on this, because it was Hans Werlemann that were at the time at OMA always documenting the work that we all had done there, and this relation to rediscover your own work through the image of Hans Werlemann is also a huge topic at OMA, which produced at the time a fundamental different visuality rather than mainstream rendering that has lost value completely because everyone can pay and buy it, you know, and it's not specific enough to be considered architecture.
Well, thank you very, very much. I think this is a good opportunity to bring our session to a close. Congratulations again on a fantastic issue, and we look forward to seeing all these works in person before too long completed.
Thank you very much, Seng-Wan. Yeah.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.